I would like to see an environmental movement that is comfortable noticing when it's wrong. We've got to rethink at every level how we're approaching things. And that involves taking on a whole lot of things that environmentalists have not been comfortable with.
For a decade, climate change has been a battleground between skeptics and environmentalists, and it's a fight the Greens are losing. Recent opinion polls show a marked decline in the public's belief in global warming. But now, some radical new ideas are emerging from leading environmentalists, challenging the movement they helped to create. Each of them has a view on why the Greens are failing and how to solve the problem.
After decades of work, after billions of dollars spent, the environmental movement has failed to achieve job one, which was to protect the planet. That's an extraordinary failure when you think about it.
These new environmentalists say the Greens must rethink their beliefs, or they're in danger of harming the planet, not helping it. Some of them say the Greens are opposing a vital solution to climate change because of an outdated prejudice against nuclear power.
When I first started realizing that nuclear wasn't all that bad, I felt like I couldn't tell anyone this. It was like, I don't know, it was like coming out as a paedophile or something. It was like this horrible, dark secret.
Others say GM food can be a solution in the developing world, and that the Greens' opposition to it is patronizing and reactionary.
They have no moral responsibility to tell us you cannot eat GM. They don't offer you any alternative. They just tell you, stay out of it.
The environment movement began in glory in the Cold War, and for many of this group, that's the time warp they're stuck in.
Environmentalists did harm by being ignorant and ideological and unwilling to change their mind based on actual evidence. And as a result, we've done harm, and I regret it. It's actually pretty upscale now compared to what it was when it first started in the 50s and 60s. It was kind of a reflection of the nature of society in a way when the Green movement was getting started, in that there was a strong countercultural element. It was intensely anti-establishment.
The environmentalists questioning their own movement are all diehard Greens. Stewart Brand is one of the most prominent environmentalists in America.
All these years we've been good at protecting nature from civilization. But the situation is now that that won't really do the job. I think those innocent times are behind us now.
Brand's challenge is all the more surprising because he was one of the first. Part of a group of California hippies who traveled the country in the 60s, warning that nature was being wrecked in the rush to bring millions of Americans the good life.
People were getting air conditioners in cars. They're moving to cities because that's toward the bright lights. They're getting jobs, they're getting education for their kids. And that is happening at a speed we've never seen before.
A continent away, a future professor of biology and award-winning environmentalist was watching the same process at work.
I remember the first car we ever got at home, and the first television and the first washing machine, and the joy that brought. You know, they seemed to be great advances, but we were trashing our environment, and it seemed that no one cared. People didn't care about the state of their atmosphere, much less their rivers. They were just open sewers, you know, full of the most toxic chemicals that you could imagine. People were just dumping incredibly damaging waste, changing the nature of our atmosphere. It was a war on nature.
That changed with an image from space. It was Stewart Brand who realized that seeing our planet from a different perspective might change people's sense of it.
One afternoon, I took a sort of quarter dose of LSD and went up on a rooftop in San Francisco, sat watching the day go by, and in the course of that had a notion that It would be interesting to have a photograph of the Earth from space. I was your basic leisurely hippie in those days, and so the next day I set about making a bunch of buttons. My button, in full paranoid voice, is, why haven't we seen a photograph of the whole Earth yet?
Thanks in part to Brand's campaign, on the 1968 Apollo mission, they took one. That image of the fragile Earth came to symbolize the start of the environment movement.
I said, we are as gods, and might as well get good at it. And then we started to have serious effect. This was the astounding thing. Earth Day in 1970 brought 20 million people into the streets.
Earth Day was the first mass environment protest. In the 3 years after the photograph of Earth was released, most of the major environment groups were started, including Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace. The target for Greenpeace was nuclear testing, and the Cold War science developing bombs 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima.
I looked like about as much as an Afro hippie as you possibly could. Yeah, we were hippies.
Patrick Moore had a PhD in ecology and was heading for an academic career when he read a group of activists in Vancouver were planning a protest.
I saw the fact that this group was meeting in the Vancouver Sun newspaper one day, and I went down there with my big afro in my Volkswagen bus, and I was chosen as one of the crew members on the first voyage to stop H-bomb testing. Greenpeace was founded strictly on the basis of being against nuclear war, and we used the nuclear tests as a way to demonstrate that. We were having a lot of fun. I mean, we had the CIA after us, we were making headlines, we had tens of thousands of people marching in the streets, and for us the revolution was a celebration.
The new green movement won victories across the planet against industrial waste and dirty technology. It was a whirlwind crusade against the excesses of modern life.
The environmental movement took off as a deep emotional thing for a lot of people. A movement which loves the country, hates cars, has doubts about these evil cities. You know, nature good, humans not so good, often really bad.
From the outset, the idea that humans were the problem had some odd consequences, like a tendency to tell people to change their ways or face an apocalypse.
We have an extremely serious world demographic situation. The population situation is bad beyond what any demographer even dreamed of 25 years ago.
In his bestseller, The Population Bomb, a leading environmentalist called Paul Ehrlich warned a startled world that hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in the 1970s.
The Hobson's choices we face, if we don't control our population and environment, the horses in Mr. Hobson's barn include famine and plague and thermonuclear war, and who knows which one or what combination will come.
Paul Ehrlich was on television night after night, and people believed that the world was in for mass starvation.
The weather satellite depicts a planet that grieves for its lost harvests. The Earth's climate is changing in little ways that mean big trouble for the human species.
Alongside the population bomb, the BBC was reporting fears of another apocalypse, a phenomenon called global cooling.
Now, the big freeze might be as deadly as nuclear war. Unless we learn otherwise, it will be prudent to suppose that the next ice age could begin to bite at any time.
There was no global starvation in the 70s and no ice age in the 80s. What happened instead, as most climate scientists now agree, was global warming.
When climate change first started, people didn't know what to do. Almost industrial society itself was called into question, that we had to get everyone to change their behaviour in all sorts of very profound ways.
For Mark Linus and his generation, this became the message of their movement, and those who disagreed were attacked. Mark himself went after the climate skeptic's biggest star, the best-selling author Bjorn Lomborg.
That's for everything you say about the environment, which is complete bullshit. That's for lying about climate change.
I used to be a proper activist.
A lot of people have been asking for this. Had to happen.
When you're an activist, the whole world's against you. In some ways, it's almost an ego trip because you're important.
Thanks very much.
Environmentalists are motivated by a sense of righteousness. They think that everyone will agree with them if only they can find out what environmentalists already know.
This time, though, that tactic wasn't working.
The facts about climate change kept on getting clearer and clearer, and we achieved absolutely nothing.
In 1996, Adam Weirback was appointed president of the oldest environment organization in America.
The environmental movement adopted the issue and tried to name it. It's called global warming, and tried to throw legislation at it, and tried to throw conferences at it, and tried to throw international agreements at it, and all those things bounced off. It was like a giant just saying, "Pwah."
There is a problem here that environmentalists have said that everything is the next apocalypse. The problem with crying wolf is that when the wolf does come, no one believes you.
It was Hollywood that brought the nightmare scenario to life this time, in films like The Day After Tomorrow. Here, global warming was a supersize apocalypse. Because the planet was getting hotter, we were going to freeze. Today, environmentalists are locked in a cyber war with skeptics, arguing obsessively over whether humans caused it and who has the better evidence. And less people believe climate change is definitely a reality.
It's incredibly frustrating that after 10 years of arguing about this, we've got absolutely nowhere. We're losing the war for public opinion. The response of Greens to that wall of public indifference has been to shout louder and in some cases to exaggerate. And that, of course, makes you very vulnerable to a backlash. Everyone's still stuck in their trenches. Pisses me off.
This movement, this thing that has animated my life since I was a kid, has failed to achieve its primary mission. We have become profoundly unpopular. I thought environmentalism is dead.
We've got to find a more pragmatic, realistic way to engage with people and actually say, look, this problem is huge. It is a problem of planetary survival to a large extent, but we can solve it with the tools that we've got in our toolbox now.
We've got to rethink at every level how we're approaching these things. And that involves taking on a whole lot of things that environmentalists have not been comfortable with. I think the ideology needs to be put aside for a while.
The environmentalists challenging their own movement agree with other Greens on one key fact. Climate change is a reality.
When we talk about Earth-climate system, it's important to understand just how extraordinarily complex it is. It's probably one of the most complex things humanity's ever tried to understand and model. We can't have any certainty about a lot of things, but whether you're a skeptic or you're a climate scientist, there is clear cause for concern and also for caution to manage risk.
Flannery, like the vast majority of climate scientists, believes caution means trying to keep the temperature of the planet from rising more than 1.5 to 2 degrees.
That will bring certain consequences. We'll probably see more drought in Australia and Africa. We'll see continued melting of the ice cap and expansion of the ocean. But we will have a reasonable chance of avoiding catastrophic climate change. 2 billion people in East and South Asia without water due to the loss of the Himalayan glaciers, or a massive rise in sea level due to the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet. The scale and speed of what we need to do is pretty breathtaking. But it's not as if all is lost, or if we don't act this very year and achieve everything, we'll be doomed. We have got some time.
Professor Flannery also supports most climate scientists' sums on the challenge. The world is pumping out 30 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide a year, much of it from coal. To stay below 2 degrees, we'd need to cut that by as much as 80% over the next half century.
We said to people, this will involve rationing, this will involve a new age of austerity. There was books written called The Party's Over. And so climate change was very much associated with, if not quite going back to the Stone Age, certainly some way in that direction.
One of the great non-starters is for one person to say to another, you should be having an ecological footprint of a peasant in Central Africa. In terms of actual human psychology, it's just nuts.
Environmentalism was incredibly conservative, and it was incredibly focused on stopping human activity. We have to have fewer humans, we have to make them act better, and we have to stop humans because they're destroying our natural world.
If we were dependent for a solution on people having a lesser quality of life, I would think we'd be doomed, because I don't think people are willing to do that.
Environmentalists are very naive about humans. When the Greens went out there and said, if you fly, you're committing a moral sin, they expected people to throw up their hands and say, oh, sorry, I'll stop doing it and I'll change my lifestyle. Actually, what people said was, oh, in that case, I don't believe in climate change. It's very simple. People are not going to give up electricity. People are going to carry on using more energy as they develop and they become more affluent. So we need to provide that energy in a zero-carbon way.
The environment movement's answer to this challenge has been to call for a massive investment in renewable energy, such as wind and solar power. Craig Bennett is Director of Campaigns at Friends of the Earth.
We need to change our relationship with energy. We have to go past this model of trying to think that it all has to come from very big centralized energy plants. It's about creating it locally to where it's generated. The real solution is renewable energy. It has to be the solution.
The problems with the renewables now is that wind blows sometimes and doesn't blow sometimes. It's intermittent. The sun shines sometimes and doesn't shine sometimes. It's intermittent.
As yet, there is also no mass energy storage device for either technology, which means for now, they can only be a partial solution.
The major problem is that it just doesn't add up. We're looking at a half century or more of radically increasing energy demand. So where are we going to get clean, constant energy?
It was that question that led Brand and others to consider a change of heart that seemed unthinkable.
When I first started realizing that nuclear wasn't all that bad, I felt like I couldn't tell anyone this. It was like, I don't know, it was like coming out as a paedophile or something. It was like this horrible, dark secret. Being an environmentalist was part of my identity, and most of my friends were environmentalists. You know, we're involved in this whole movement together. I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and it was an article of faith that if you were an environmentalist, you were against nuclear power. And that's how I used to feel about it. This was an emotional preoccupation. I didn't look at the evidence, I just knew that nuclear was bad and was wrong.
It was the Greenpeace voyage from Vancouver in 1971 that launched the Greens' anti-nuclear stand in earnest. The mission was to end America's nuclear weapon testing in Alaska, and against all odds, they succeeded.
We just exploded after that. Being anti-nuclear meant being against the destruction of civilization, which we thought was a fairly reasonable position at the time.
My parents' generation had just prosecuted one of the most horrendous wars in history, and at the end of it had been willing to incinerate 100,000 innocent people in Japan using nuclear power. It was a shell-shocked era. You could unleash power at a scale that had just been absolutely undreamt of before.
During the 70s, the campaign against nuclear weapons grew into a worldwide force. At the same time, the new industry of nuclear power was growing. It was a carbon dioxide-free source of constant energy.
Go on, chaps!
But from the outset, the industry was controversial. It was secretive. The extent of Britain's worst nuclear accident in 1957 at Windscale in Cumbria was concealed, and subsequent leaks there and at other plants were covered up.
I was on the Greenpeace campaign at Windscale. We were right on that campaign. Those plants were dirty and were emitting far too much radiation into the environment, and we succeeded in getting those nuclear establishments to clean themselves up.
It's 12:40 in Los Angeles. Temperature is 68 degrees.
The secretive nature of the industry also sparked every conspiracy theory imaginable.
We're going to focus on nuclear power. That almost magical transformation of matter into energy that the experts tell us may be our best shot at energy self-sufficiency.
The China syndrome was Hollywood's version of the apocalyptic consequences of an accident in a nuclear plant.
Very independent. What was that?
Felt like an earthquake.
What the hell?
In this fictional story, the reactor came within seconds of a meltdown that could burn through the Earth's crust to China.
There was some local panic, but since the danger was contained...
12 days after the film came out, a partial meltdown occurred at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant on America's east coast. No one died, but the nuclear industry there never recovered. Then, in April 1986, another accident happened. It was at Chernobyl, in the former Soviet Union.
Unconfirmed reports suggest that not one, but 2 nuclear reactors are still pouring radiation.
The extent and the dangers of what's being described as the world's worst ever nuclear disaster.
Northwest England have been advised not to drink rainwater for the next...
Soviet authorities tried at first to conceal the accident, but a cloud of radiation spread across Europe. First reports said 5 million people were contaminated, and that at least 1 million would die of cancer.
Нам никто не говорит, а потом говорят, 4-й блок сорвался, а 4-й блок. Так вот это дым такой был, тогда было губы такие сохнут и горькие как будто.
In Pripyat, the city nearest the reactor, a mass evacuation of 50,000 people began.
Панику подняли, вот, люди. Что как мог, например, у кого машина, въезжали, что это, ну, машины давали, вывозили. Сорвалось, вот, и говорю, боже мой, значит, ну, завтра мы помрем.
The abandoned city was sealed off, the center of an exclusion zone that is still in place, a symbol of the devastating consequences of a nuclear accident.
Hammer and sickle up there. So
Yeah.
the only one left in the former Soviet Union, probably.
Yeah.
So that's a time capsule, isn't it? For anyone who's against nuclear power, this is all you need to see, isn't it? This is an entirely deserted city, whole landscape denuded of people, and because of the evils of nuclear. I never thought I'd see this. A Dodgems parade with birch trees growing up in the middle.
Chernobyl happened at the time when the Soviet Union was about to collapse. And we can see that people were getting ready for the 1st of May celebrations. To many people, this catastrophe had a metaphorical meaning, like collapse of something really important, collapse of something that was thought to be reliable and eternal almost.
I was 13 when this disaster originally happened, and I remember the news reports about a radioactive cloud drifting over Western Europe, and it seemed like the apocalypse had happened. And here we are standing about 200 yards away. I can't quite believe it, actually.
For the last 25 years, the disaster has been reported as a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale, an impression environment groups have reinforced. In 2006, Greenpeace predicted the death toll from Chernobyl would be 93,000 by 2050. The previous year, a UN report had challenged this version of the Chernobyl story. It followed a major scientific investigation into the accident and its aftermath.
This is a kindergarten, right?
Louisa Vinton was coordinator of the UN inquiry and compiled the research of 100 recognised experts from across the world.
Can you give me a big picture of this? Because, you know, I've grown up with the knowledge or the thought that this is the world's worst industrial disaster.
The problem with Chernobyl is that there's always been this diversion between what scientists know is the impact of Chernobyl and what the public thinks is the impact of Chernobyl. And in fact, the health effects of Chernobyl are much more mild than anyone has really ever assumed.
The UN investigation concluded the death toll to date was not in the tens of thousands. It was less than 65. Most of them workers who tried to contain the accident. The report said the death toll from cancer would not be 1 million as first reported. It was closer to 9,000 people who might ultimately be cancer victims.
In any population, you're going to have a large number of cancers. So some of the science that has come out on Chernobyl simply looks at rates of cancer and says, oh my God, but what you have to do is be very scientific. There's no marker on a tumor that says, I'm from radiation or I'm from smoking. You'll never know that for sure. So the best you can do is say, this is an area affected, this is not, and compare those, and that's being done all the time, and you're getting nothing there. The only cancer that is directly attributable to the Chernobyl accident is thyroid cancer.
Up to 6,000 people, many of them children, contracted thyroid cancer from drinking contaminated milk. 99% of those cases have been successfully treated.
But there were some birth defects, right, from people who were exposed.
Now, this is a myth that just won't die, and I think part of the problem is that people really are sensitized to photographs of babies with deformities. It's something no one would wish on anyone. And in fact, the conclusion is that there is no connection between Chernobyl radiation and birth defects of any sort. No one was born deformed as a consequence of Chernobyl.
But the fear of possible deformities had its own impact. Abortion rates shot up across the region after the accident, and very high levels of alcoholism and stress were reported among evacuees who feared they were going to die.
The biggest public health impact from the Chernobyl accident was psychological. Fear of radiation has proved to be a far more potent threat to health than radiation itself.
25 years after the accident, most of the exclusion zone gives off as much radiation in a week as a return flight from Europe to America. The only people living here are 300 elderly evacuees who moved back into their homes against the authorities' wishes.
Получили квартиру, потом я все-таки разными средствами приехал на свою родину, где я родился. Ну, приехали мы в 93-м году. Они же настрашили нас радиацией. А я говорю, слушай, замеряй, сколько у меня радиации во дворе там будет. Ну, вот это вот, где хата. Он пришел, говорит, тут нету чисто. Тут, говорит, можете жить 100 лет. И все. Ну, так мы раз 100 лет, так давай тут и жить, и все дело. Пришел я в свою хату, и теперь пошел, и так и живу.
Like nearly everyone else of my generation, I've grown up with this, the shadow of Chernobyl was almost as profound as the shadow of the Cold War. It was one of those things in the 80s, particularly that one grew up being scared about. So to come here and to conclude that we need more nuclear power would seem to be odd, but I think that's how I feel. The reactor that exploded at Chernobyl, that was an old style technology which had inherent safety problems, but that doesn't actually tell you anything about modern nuclear power any more than you'd refuse to fly in a jumbo jet today because there was a plane crash in 1960. What's past is past.
There are others who were once dedicated anti-nuclear campaigners who have also changed their mind. Patrick Moore now runs the Clean and Safe Energy Coalition, a lobby group funded by the nuclear industry. He left Greenpeace in the 1980s, saying it had become anti-science.
Chernobyl set off a massive wave of opposition to nuclear energy. I mean, if you look back at the history of the people involved, the same people that were in the anti-nuclear war movement became the people in the anti-nuclear energy movement.
Since this period, and the nationwide protests following 3 Mile Island, the American government has not authorized the construction of a single new nuclear plant.
We were right that the nuclear industry had problems, but that didn't mean that we should be against nuclear energy entirely. It meant that it needed to clean itself up, same way as any other industry.
But traditional environmentalists remain completely opposed to nuclear energy.
The problem with nuclear power is it has and will continue to represent a real diversion and distraction of both money and political will from those real solutions. So over the last 50 years, we've seen billions of pounds worth of public money being spent on the nuclear industry. If those billions of pounds of public money had been spent on renewables, we would be in a very different place.
There are lots of problems with nuclear. The waste problem hasn't been solved. The proliferation issues haven't been solved. One can never be absolutely sure about the safety and terrorist threat that's associated with them. Now, that's changed by the fact that climate change is such a big problem. And because it's a low carbon energy source, of course we have to look at the issues again. The evidence shows that we can manage without it. And given all those problems, why would you not want to manage without it?
For Tim Flannery and other new environmentalists, however, the nuclear debate has moved on. Climate change is the greater danger now.
We're no longer facing a Cold War between two sides with enough weapons to blow up the whole planet. It doesn't mean all of the danger's gone out of nuclear power. Nuclear waste is a significant waste problem, but it's not on the scale of coal. Coal-fired power plants produce the most incredibly damaging waste we know on scales changing the nature of our atmosphere.
The irony is, one consequence of the Greens' campaign against nuclear power is that it contributed to more coal.
We made a mistake. We felt that we had accomplished a great deal, but when the United States was building about 40 nuclear reactors per decade, we stopped that. And what did they do? They started building 40 or 80 coal plants per decade.
We have caused extra gigatons of greenhouse gases to get into the atmosphere by being so precious about nuclear.
Greenpeace maintained coal plants were built in America because nuclear power is expensive and the coal lobby is extremely powerful.
Looking forward, environmentalists who continue to prevent important substitutes like nuclear for coal burning are reprehensible.
India is a country of 1 billion, growing at incredible speed. Electricity is a route out of poverty here, which puts both Indian and Western environmentalists in a difficult position. Greens opposed nuclear in the West, and it burnt more coal. Here, they still oppose nuclear, but they don't want coal either.
Today's Indian is going out there with a vengeance to make money and to possess wealth and all that he was only dreaming of watching on television and cinema from the West. Now, environmentalists and others who come from those parts of the world are telling the developing countries not to exploit coal in order to make the life of an ordinary Indian better than what it is. But it is not stoppable. India will do it in the name of development, in the name of progress.
This is what is fueling that boom. In northeast India, they are mining coal so fast that fires are burning out of control underground. 70% of India's electricity comes from coal. Environmentalists, including many in India, say the country cannot develop on coal the way the West did. The coal is cheap, and India still has 400 million without electricity. For a leading new environmentalist here, that means Greens everywhere have to change their thinking.
An Indian environmentalist is not a Western environmentalist. You must understand it. For us, development is as important as environment. We are not environmentalists who believe that, there'll be no coal. We see no option but to see coal being burnt. For us, the issue is making sure there's affordable power for all. Making sure that the poorest of India actually get power. Can you live without electricity? Can you live without electricity? Can I live without electricity? So why do you expect anyone else to do so?
We have a world order where there are some who are top dogs and others who are not. And we are among those who are not. If you try and keep us from the table, we'll fight our way to it. what you're doing is attempting to protect a way of life in an unsustainable level of living. You only have to see the skyline at night in the polluting and sinning West. It's really fairyland. But there is a huge cost being paid by the world, by humanity, and by future generations.
Climate change is one of those extremely difficult issues, that possibly the most difficult that humankind has ever confronted, because here is a problem which is directly linked to wealth creation, to economic growth. All that we have done till now has really been to fiddle around with small solutions to a very big problem.
Sunita Narayan believes it's vital that green activists in the developing world don't make the same mistakes as Western environmentalists.
We have a danger of going the Western way, where you do not want to really push the envelope to ask for more. And I think that's really where, to me, India must get it right. And I guess that's my role here, is to push and kick and to say, don't go the Western route, because they really haven't fixed the problem.
5 out of 6 people live in the developing world, so how the poor there get electricity may determine what happens to the planet.
We can invest in cleaner fuel today, but that cleaner fuel has a price, and that needs to be paid for. Nobody wants the right to pollution. Everybody is securing the right to development, and there's a big difference there.
Former Indian Minister Mani Shankar Iyer believes the way to pay for these cleaner technologies is by setting up a global planet protection fund.
All countries in the world, apart from the least developed countries, should contribute an equal amount to such a fund. The Planet Protection Fund will then buy up environment-friendly technologies as a fund and make these technologies available free to all members of the fund. And this would mean that there would be an economic incentive to use environment-friendly technologies instead of non-environment-friendly technologies.
In the immediate future, India and China will continue investing in nuclear energy, whether environmentalists like it or not. India is building 4 plants and planning 5 times that. China is building 24, with about 40 more to come. That's expensive, and other poorer developing countries will need help to do the same.
The climate problem is not just a technological or environmental problem, it's a social problem as well. And therefore it's inextricably interwoven with the rising above absolute poverty of the developing countries and their citizens.
The richer countries have to pay for poorer countries to get the green technologies, so there doesn't have to be this trade-off between development and survival.
I would like to see an environmental movement that is comfortable noticing when it's wrong and announcing when it's wrong. We have not been particularly alert to unintended consequences that resulted from our campaigns.
For Stewart Brand and other new environmentalists, the human cost of their campaigns is something other Greens have sometimes overlooked. In the Kibera slum outside Nairobi, 1 million people live on 1.5 square miles. There is no sewage system and no running water. Cholera and typhoid are common. But of all the diseases, malaria is the biggest killer.
65% of the population in Africa get malaria. 30% will die if no intervention is taken. The vulnerable are the pregnant women and the children, especially children to 5 years.
Malaria here is spread by the slum's unhygienic conditions, by the stagnant water and rubbish in the streets.
Some of those things are not within our reach, like where my clinic is situated. In front of it is an open drainage. There's nothing much I can do about that.
40 years ago, there was a solution that would have cut malaria in Kibera dramatically.
after the Second World War, the Americans had captured a lot of nerve gases and so forth from the Nazis and realised that with a bit of tweaking they could use them as pesticides. So crop dusting became a big thing, just flying over agricultural lands and non-agricultural lands spraying these pesticides. But it was incredibly dangerous. It was a war on nature.
In the early 1960s, just before the environmental movement took off, a zoologist called Rachel Carson wrote a book saying that pesticides were killing wild birds and were potentially dangerous to humans. The book became an international bestseller.
It became a seminal, almost like Bible for the movement. It's interesting to note, though, Rachel Carson did not promote banning pesticides. She says the irresponsible use of pesticides should be ended, but the interpretation was a zero-tolerance policy. It became a black and white issue.
One pesticide in particular became the target, DDT. It was dangerous sprayed outside indiscriminately, but used inside in small quantities, it was very effective against malaria. Environmentalists campaigned for governments around the world to ban it. What nobody realized at the time was the unintended consequences that might have.
In the US, DDT had largely stopped malaria. But as DDT was getting to Africa, it was slowed down by global environmental groups, and malaria, which was starting to diminish, came back strong and stayed strong for a few more decades.
I think the lives of the people are compromised. DDT was working. It was working. I would say it was a mistake.
In 2006, the World Health Organization reversed its position on DDT, a move supported by environment groups like the World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace. They agreed malaria was the greater evil and that DDT in small quantities was an acceptable compromise.
I think the environmental instinct when the people in the movement detect something they think is a problem, the instinct is to say, stop. There's a certain simplistic purity to that approach. Banning has a very attractive thing. We make this problem go away by banishing it entirely from existence.
The same philosophy of zero tolerance was present from the outset in the campaign against the environmentalists' nemesis, genetically modified crops.
It's important to understand the reasons for opposition that has been voiced over the years to GM crops. And it's not necessarily about the technology, it's more often than not about the business model. If you want to support the smallest farmers around the world, then it's not about trying to sell them patent seed technologies which are then controlled and owned by the world's largest corporations, which then mean that those farmers have to go back and pay money to those companies every year.
The risks are of quite a different nature to many other environmental issues. Because if you have a ton of oil that gets spilt, it is only ever going to be a ton of oil. If you get something that goes wrong with a GM plant, for example, then one plant can become millions or even billions.
Mark Linus, an environmental activist and writer, was once part of a direct action group.
Being an anti-GM activist was great fun. It was an excuse to stay up all night, because everything you did you had to do in the undercover of darkness. I was destroying some sweet corn with a group of, I think it must have been about a dozen of us. And suddenly the police were there at the end of the field. There were flashing lights, the radio's going, and we all just lay down in the middle of this crop. Then they went away again. They somehow didn't catch us. You know, those are the kinds of little escapades you get into when you're doing direct action.
Bye-bye, Alpha!
It wasn't a science-based, rational thing. It was an emotional thing, and it was about the relationship between humans and other living things, that we should not play God, if you like. We should not change living organisms in unnatural ways, because things would come back and bite us.
That opposition was also guided by an idea called the precautionary principle, which meant if something carried even a remote chance of damage to the environment, you shouldn't do it, no matter how great the possible advantages might be.
If new technologies were vampires, I guess the precautionary principle would be garlic. From that day forward, environmentalists have been against genetic engineering. It was wrong then and it's wrong now. They started imagining that all sorts of monsters would be created either on purpose or accidentally, and the whole world would turn to green goo and we would all starve. Say, oh, you know, the precautionary principle says that we mustn't go ahead with this technology until we have absolute scientific certainty that no harm can possibly come in any fashion whatsoever, ever. Which means you don't try anything.
But the potential benefits of GM technology are extraordinary. Brand has come to the University of California to meet Dr. Pamela Ronald, who runs a genetic engineering lab here.
My lab's interested in understanding how rice plants resist disease and how they tolerate stresses. In India and Bangladesh alone, the estimates are that 4 million tons of rice, enough to feed 30 million people, is lost to flooding every year.
So 15 years ago, Dr. Ronald set out to develop a strain of rice to withstand flooding.
Okay, so I'm going to show you rice plants in different stages of transformation. And the way we start is we take a seed and we...
Dr. Ronald and her team succeeded in developing a variety of rice that can effectively hold its breath underwater for 2 weeks. After 4 years of field trials, the flood-resistant plants are now being grown in the developing world.
So the new varieties have been released in India, in Bangladesh, and in the Philippines. And now farmers are growing those seeds. They can do whatever they want with it. They can eat it, they could sell it. We don't say genetic engineering is going to solve all agricultural problems. We just say it's a tool in a toolbox for sustainable agriculture.
Many environmentalists argue that GM technology is about making profits for big businesses, but Dr. Ronald's work is funded entirely by government grants.
There's no corporate involvements. USAID funded it, and these are national breeding programs, so those are supported by government agencies.
In America, despite protests by environmentalists, a selection of GM crops became commercially available in the mid-1990s.
Aha, thank you. I will.
In most of the roadside diners and fast food joints of the country, the tacos and hot dogs and burritos are now GM corn and GM soya.
This is GM food. Something on the order of half or 70% of the food that Americans eat is GM in one form or another. We've been eating it for over 10 years now, and it's delicious. So 10 or 12 years on, I think we can start to say it's fine that we were cautious, but turns out what we were worried about is not a problem, so let's move on.
In Europe, it was a different story. The anti-GM campaign spread across the continent. In 2001, the European Union published a summary of 81 scientific studies following GM crops over 15 years. None found any evidence of harm to humans or the environment. But by then, a very influential lobby had taken shape.
We wanted to stop the technology. I wanted to make sure that it never got out of the starting blocks. And of course we had sections of the right-wing media, the Daily Mail, who were directly behind us, the organic movement, Prince Charles, all these kinds of people. It's actually a very conservative thing to try and do to stop a new technology. And that's why it was so spectacularly successful. And GM was largely stopped in Europe and has been to this very day. My change of heart on GM, to be honest, was was really just looking at how it's been used and consumed by millions of people. So, you know, that's new information, it's new data, and you've got to change your mind in response to that. Did I get vilified by people for changing my mind? Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, still do.
Unfortunately, we're at the stage now where a lot of what environmentalists are asking for and demanding is potentially counterproductive. You know, if you're serious that climate change is this great global priority, then you've got to be prepared to make some difficult decisions and change your mind about things.
Most of the hazards that we had invoked were mythical. There was no evidence to support them. Then I started looking at the potential benefits, the possibility that this could be hugely beneficial for the developing world.
It was that possibility that turned the anti-GM battle into a bitter war.
I would like to see an environmental movement that said, it turns out that our fears about genetically engineered food crops were exaggerated, we're glad of that. That's a adaptive, productive, and ideally somewhat humble and modest stance to take to the real world.
Africa is the only continent on Earth where hunger and poverty are both still rising. 200 million are at risk from malnutrition here. 20 million of them are children under 5. It will be the biggest victim of climate change and is now a battleground between African and Western Greens and scientists like Dr. Florence Wambogu, who are fighting their influence here.
I see science as a tool to improve the lives of the people. I do not know any country that developed without embracing science and technology. I do not know any country that came out of poverty without improving the lives of the people through food. This place is called Mbere. It's one of the poorest of the poor of provinces of Kenya.
This village relies on a crop called sorghum, which they grind and eat as porridge. It has very low nutritional value, but it's often the only meal a day for 200 million facing hunger.
This is what I've been harvested from here. There's still a variety of sorghum been harvested from here. And this is a drying. Oh, wait, what are you? Muere. This is another.
They grow sorghum because it's one of the only crops that can withstand drought. Kenya, like much of Africa, is vulnerable to the erratic weather of climate change.
We had very, very serious drought last year. Very, very serious. And now this year we have some floods. We can't predict what will happen next season. Maybe next season there'll be nothing. This place gives me memories of my growing up as a child in the rural area, in a very subsistence farming background. We didn't have enough food to eat. We were really poor. We were 10 in my family. Many times we ate 1 meal a day, and we were really hungry. I told my mom that if I study, I'll come back and do something.
Dr. Wambogu did a 3-year postgraduate job with the biotechnology company Monsanto and got a PhD in genetic engineering. Eight years ago, Dr. Wambogu won a $20 million grant from the Bill Gates Foundation in America and funding from the biotech industry and Kenyan government. Now, in this laboratory in Nairobi, she is recreating nature, designing a genetically engineered sorghum plant that will actually be good for you.
So what you have here, this is nutritionally enhanced sorghum through genetic transformation. And the sorghum is carrying genes, is carrying traits for vitamin A, iron, and zinc. Something has never happened before. It's 5 years' work. This year we got, really, I would say, a little bit of a miracle.
In 2008, a major UN study on agriculture said GM crops were not the only solution for farmers in the developing world, but did have a role to play. This year, the Kenyan government decided to pass a biosafety bill that will allow GM crops to be grown here for the first time. But Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth say GM crops aren't safe. They're a risk to the environment, and their benefits are exaggerated.
Our view is that GM technology in Africa is inappropriate and unhelpful and risky, and we were opposed to it alongside many of the farmer groups in Africa. In virtually no instance has it actually delivered useful benefits. And so for this technology to be seen as some kind of solution to the problems in developing countries is just wrong.
They have no moral responsibility to tell us you cannot eat GM. They also behave like we can't even talk for ourselves. We need someone to talk for us. It is patronizing. Africans are the ones who can develop their own continent. African scientists must provide the lead to really solving our own issues.
From the moment food crops engineered for nutrition first emerged, the battle against them has been ferocious. Rice is another staple food for the poorest of Africa and Asia. It also lacks essential vitamins for children at risk of malnutrition.
The absence of vitamin A causes vast amounts of blindness in children and deaths in children, on the order of 1 million a year.
Scientists have developed a form of genetically modified rice which could help fight malnutrition.
11 years ago, a strain of genetically modified rice was developed that incorporated vitamin A. It was called golden rice.
But some anti-GM campaigners say the rice will not tackle the root causes of poverty.
Environmentalists have done all they can to stop it.
For many years now, for over a decade, the GM industry has been making all kinds of promises about so-called golden rice. And in the meantime, we've seen tens of millions of pounds being put into research in rich countries to try and deliver what is held up as a magic solution. Let's support people on the ground now where they need the support the most to overcome these problems, rather than having some kind of ideological belief that there's going to be a miracle cure out there sometime in the future.
All that golden rice has done is provide a distraction from getting on with the stuff that we know works. And our proposal is that we have more diverse diets, and that's in fact being found in many projects to be the best way forward.
To deliberately and knowledgeably fight a kind of rice that would cure blindness in children just strikes me as folly.
Golden rice has now passed field trials and will soon be available to farmers in Asia. After the golden rice campaign, the Greens' fight against GM food found a new target. In 2002, a devastating drought hit southern Africa. The World Health Organization warned that 2.4 million people in Zambia alone were at risk of starvation. The American government sent a shipment of food aid containing GM corn, and Zambia refused it.
The government in Zambia had been told by environmental groups that the stuff was bad for them, and it was bad for agriculture and it was going to be bad for Zambia. And so the food arrived, people are still starving, and they were prevented from getting perfectly good food.
Shortly afterwards, Friends of the Earth and 140 African community leaders joined other organizations in signing an open letter to the US government and the UN. The letter contained alarmist allegations including that GM food was unsafe and that it could give rise to health problems, including chronic toxic effects and cancer.
I think environmentalists did harm by being ignorant and ideological and unwilling to change their mind based on actual evidence. And as a result, we've done harm, and I regret it.
Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth strongly deny this accusation.
Let's be absolutely clear about GM food aid to Zambia in 2002. We were very clear with the Zambian High Commission in London that if there was no other option other than the GM food aid, then they should take it and use it. So the suggestion that we encourage them to reject that if there were no alternatives is absolutely wrong.
It's entirely wrong to suggest that somehow environmental groups told a starving population not to accept this aid. The decision was made by the Zambian government. The support that then emerged for that decision happened after the Zambian government had made that decision. And the African community organisations that supported that decision did so because there was non-GM food aid available and because they were concerned about the impact that GM food aid would have in trying to shift the African economy to being dependent on GM.
The reality is, Greens anywhere will not be able to act as the gatekeepers of genetic engineering. Much of the leading edge of the science is now in the developing world. India is deciding GM licenses on its own terms, and China is developing the technology at breakneck speed. GM scientist Dr. Shantu Shantaram runs an industry-funded lobby group campaigning for GM crops.
It is so dramatic. China has made its decision. It has already adopted GM technology. They are not going to listen to anybody. They are not going to talk to anybody. They are going to do it. If China does it, then India will do it. And if India does it, the rest of Southeast Asia will do it.
China is already growing genetically engineered corn and tobacco, as well as rice, tomatoes and cotton. £2.5 billion has been set aside there to advance the technology.
The genie is out of the bottle. Environmentalists will not win this war in the end. They will throw a lot of obstacles, they will delay, they will obfuscate, but it is not stoppable. This technology has arrived and it is here to stay.
There is also a futuristic form of genetic engineering called synthetic biology, which decodes the genetic material in bacteria and combines it to create new living species.
Synthetic biology makes GM look like child's play. I mean, it's like a horse and cart at a Formula One rally. I mean, synthetic biology is the tools to actually create life from scratch artificially.
In the future, this bacteria-based biotechnology could create clean energy and clean fuel. It's a revolutionary science that Greens could be part of from the outset.
This is a technology I see as potentially green from the ground up. And that's why I want environmentalists and environmental scientists to embrace and run with biotechnology rather than try to stand in its way.
For Brand, the Greens have an essential role to play in working with the science, not against it, because some of the technology now emerging is more controversial than anything encountered yet. In the next 50 years, sources of clean energy will multiply as wind and solar technologies evolve and others develop. In this prototype nuclear fusion laboratory in California, they're attempting to create waste-free, radiation-free nuclear energy.
Right. This is where they will prove or not prove that fusion can be used as a power source, that this kind of fusion power is a potential way to get really clean energy on a really massive scale.
The aim is to create a self-sustained nuclear fusion reaction in a safe, controlled setting. To do that, they have built the world's largest and most powerful laser. 192 laser beams are focused onto a single target point, smaller than a human hair.
This is a full-scale size target. And what you can see is it's a little gold can. And inside of it, in the middle, that little red ball, is where the fusion fuel is. And the fusion fuel is hydrogen. The laser focuses energy into here and heats up this target to millions of degrees in a few billionths of a second. And that little tiny ball would, if we did this just 10 times a second, would provide all the energy we need for 1 million people.
This whole facility is what they call a technological sublime. And it's like the Crystal Palace, it's like the Golden Gate Bridge. People like to come and see this stuff and just feel, wow, we're capable of doing that kind of thing. Well, go ahead on it. And we'll see, does it play out?
The issue, though, is how long it will take us to get this clean energy in place. There is a new field of science called geoengineering, and how Greens respond to it will be their next big challenge. It's emerging because of a growing fear we might not convert to clean energy quickly enough to stay ahead of climate change.
As people do the sums, thinking how long it is going to take to turn around the amount of greenhouse gases that we're emitting, as we start getting climate catastrophes, the sense is going to be, we've got to buy ourselves some more time to turn this huge ship around. And so, can we keep the planet cool while we sort this out?
The idea began with a volcano. In 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines. 20 million tons of volcanic ash and gas exploded into the atmosphere. As it hung there, it absorbed and reflected sunlight. The following year, the planet cooled by 0.5 degree Celsius.
If we want to mess with, tweak, slightly adjust climate, this is one way to do it, just be a volcano on purpose. If we did one Mount Pinatubo every year, it could cool the planet down by as much as 3 degrees. And that's enough to match a doubling of the greenhouse gases that humans put out.
Proper Greens hate geoengineering because the idea is that if it gives politicians a way to have a sticking plaster solution to climate change, they won't bother about the real hard work of stopping carbon dioxide emissions.
Geoengineering also has its dangers. Carbon dioxide would still be piling up in the atmosphere. If a Pinatubo-style experiment suddenly stopped and sunlight hit the Earth as normal, the temperature of the planet would jump dramatically. Which is exactly why new environmentalists want the Greens to be involved.
The environmental movement has to be preoccupied with ethics, right? We desperately need systems of international agreement which will decide whether these technologies are employed or not. China or the US on their own could geoengineer the climate. So you'd have a single country making an intervention in the Earth system which everyone on Earth had to share the consequences of.
There are risks with geoengineering if we allow the CO2 emissions to continue to rise in the hope that geoengineering will sort it out. And some of these risks are going to be as bad as they could be with the climate change that we're seeking to avoid.
I would love it if geoengineering never happened, but realistic enough to realize that it may well be necessary. All us environmentalists should be urging geoengineering research to go ahead full scale, full pace, with the fond hope that we never use it.
Our position as Friends of the Earth is, yes, we should be undertaking the research into geoengineering. Yes, we should be thinking very carefully already about what kind of very carefully controlled international regulatory regime we need, if ever this needs to be deployed. But let's hope, for goodness sake, we never have to use geoengineering. And we won't have to use geoengineering if we make sure governments and business and communities are able to start focusing on the real solutions to climate change, not false solutions.
For Brand and others, the scale of the challenges ahead requires a different kind of green movement to face them. First, a broader movement that is not just about protecting the natural world. Adam Werbach now advises big business on environment issues. He wants the Greens to become a mass movement for ordinary people.
Right now, our greatest challenge is that it's become a movement of the elite. We can play with our Mac, and we can eat organic food, and we can leave everyone else alone. Or we can enter the fray, and we can fight the battle. The question I ask is, how do you reach 1 billion people? Greenpeace never did that. There's Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Walmart, the largest corporations on the planet. They're the ones who have the audience. Everyone is asking not how do I stop climate change, but how do I live a better life right now? And we have an answer. We have an answer.
They all want solutions to environmental problems, and many believe if GM food can help feed people, it's a solution.
We've created a global civilization. We've created all of these extraordinary things. I am absolutely confident we can take those next steps. But I guess the choice really before us is either we continue believing that we live in a survival of the fittest world and we'll try to go it alone, or else we will work together. The difficulty for our generations, we have to make the choice. Next generation will be too late.
They also want a movement that's realistic about the world's energy needs. And for some, that means seeing nuclear power as an answer, not a nightmare.
The environmental movement is in the way of where we need to go. They've either got to move with the times or get out of the way. That involves giving up some cherished beliefs as Greens, but we've got to do that, I think, to meet people halfway. We can't expect the whole world to be converted to environmentalism. That was never going to happen.
If we got ourselves into this fix, we should be able to get ourselves out of this fix. And that means thinking some ways we've not thought before. And I don't think it means going back. It means setting aside for the time being the joys of ideology, the joys of romanticism. If we do all that, things look bright. Back in the 60s, I said, we are as gods and might as well get good at it. We're now in a situation where we are as gods and have to get good at it.